I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight, I'm delighted to introduce you to a very talented author by the name of Chamberlain Diala and his book, Hannah, the Rainmaker, and Other Stories of My Ancestors. This collection of stories, rooted in African tradition, offers a blend of family history and folklore, enriched by the author's childhood experience during war times and his deep immersion in village life. We're delighted to have this very talented author join us here today on Spotlight. We thank our team at Atticus Publishing for helping us put him in the spotlight today. And we ask viewers like you to support writers like him by subscribing to our channel and by purchasing his wonderful book. The links are below this interview. Chamberlain, great to see you here today on Spotlight.
Thank you, Logan. Glad to be here.
Let's give the folks at home the big picture and overview. What is Hannah the Rainmaker all about?
So Hannah the Rainmaker is a story about an elderly woman in my village many years ago who was prolific for making rains and keeping rains away during festive times and weddings. So it's one of many stories in the book that chronicles my life as a kid and some of the stories that were told to me by my uncles and my grandmothers and my ancestors. I try to capture them in 8 short stories in this book.
Tell us a little bit about where you grew up and what that was like.
I was born and raised in a country called Nigeria. Many of you know Nigeria, in the southeast part of the country called Aba. My village is in Ikeduru, Owerri, where we ran to when the Civil War of Biafra started in 1967. And I spent 3 years during that war in the village. As a little boy, I was able to hang out with friends and family and cousins, and was raised in a family of 8, very rich family life. We had a huge family, the Dialas, but the village life was very immersive and very informative.
How did your experience during wartime influence your work as a writer?
Well, I was able to meet my uncles and my aunties who were good storytellers. They wanted to tell us about our lineage as kids. The African culture is one of passing information orally through oral history and telling stories about ancestors. And I was always curious about those stories. So I was able to ask a lot of questions. I was able to sit in on their conversations and absorb many of those stories. And as I said in the book, these stories have percolated in my mind for many years. And I've just decided to write some of them down to share with the public.
Is there a favorite of the stories that you have?
Yes, my favorite is the title of the book. That's why I made it the title, called Hannah the Rainmaker. And the reason is my favorite is because in our culture in those days, there were not a lot of powerful women who were able to compete with the men in a profession that were known exclusively for men. She learned how to make rain from her husband, and when her husband died, she took on the profession. And as a result, the 2 other rainmakers in the village resented her and competed with her, and she was able to match wits with them and win many of those matches. So she was a role model for me, and I wanted to highlight the strength of such a woman in my experience.
When you're writing this book, it must have been a great trip down memory lane, thinking of the stories that were told to you and the people you had met, and then going through the process of fictionalizing some events and so forth, right?
Correct.
Tell us about that. Did you enjoy it?
I did enjoy it. In talking to many of my elderly relatives when I first started hearing the stories, I would take informal notes. When I started to put them together, there are, of course, memory lapses and other things that I needed to verify. And so I will call my uncles who are still alive. One of them is 88 years old. My mother is 85 years old. And I will call them and verify some of the information that I've heard. And if they weren't knowledgeable about them, they will refer me to some other relatives. So it was quite a trip down memory lane. Some of those stories were confirmed by my peers who had heard various versions of the same story, and I was able to piece together a coherent whole.
What do you hope readers take away from your stories?
Well, one of the lessons I want readers to take away is the richness of the oral history and the richness of the village life. Oftentimes, in our rush to civilization, we forget the collectivism and the community that makes up families, and the value that those families and those collectivist approaches imbue in children when they're growing up. The importance of respect for the elderly, the importance of being community, the importance of value, and the influences of peers that help us shape who we are and the way that we conduct ourselves in our daily lives. These are some of the lessons that I learned and my cousins learned that have kept us close together, closely bonded and in touch with each other after all these many years. And I think society will be much better off if we had such bonds and closeness with friends and relatives as a community.
The way you grew up is a little bit like I grew up. I mean, we grew up with family members and friends and playing games and telling stories. But the way you grew up is completely different from the way kids grow up today.
Absolutely.
I mean, kids are glued to, this is what you see kids doing today.
Yes.
And
Yes.
only this. And so much is lost. I mean, they don't talk to people in the same room. They text across the room. You talk about an oral history. They're going to have a transcript because there's no oral history at all because everything's written. It's not actually even spoken. Let me also ask you to touch upon that, but how old were you when you came to this country? And that must have been a big culture shock in a way. It was a big difference when you came to the United States. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so I grew up with cousins and relatives, and we played games as kids, mostly outdoors, mostly in the woods, running around, being physical. When I was 17, finishing high school, my parents thought to pursue education was the best option for me. I had an uncle who was a professor of political science in Columbia, South Carolina, and they thought that I should go live with him and pursue education. And that's what I did. It was a culture shock in the sense because I've never been to a place like the United States before. Lights in the sky, highway traffic, cars zooming all over the place. Yeah. And it was very impressive. But it was also eye-opening in the sense that there's not a lot of neighborliness. My uncle, who lived in his house, would only see the neighbor when she's passing by and just wave and didn't even know her full name. And she was shocked when I came to mow her lawn and she was trying to offer me money. And I said, no, I didn't need money. And she thought something was wrong with me. But it was that part of the communalism that I was raised in that made me reach out and try to know who the neighbors are and what they're all about.
Yeah, and that's such a great part of living, such a great part of life. I'm fortunate enough to live part of the year in a very rural place. And it's like you described in many ways where, I'll look over and, my neighbor's mowing my lawn. And, that would never happen in suburban New York City, but it'll happen in a rural place. We tend to need our neighbors and care about our neighbors more. It's basically part of survival when you're living in a place that's more remote, don't you think?
Absolutely. And that's part of what we've lost in today's society where everybody's so individual. The individualism has its ruggedness, but it sort of creates a detachment in society. And that's part of what we're losing, even in the African communities, where people are migrating from the village into the cities and sort of we're losing this ability to be community, to be neighborly, to be kind to one another. And that's part of what's creating the kinds of social tensions and divisions that we're experiencing in society, not just in the United States, but across the globe. You've seen the divides that has been happening, whether it's social, political, religious, all of those things as a result of this inability to form a community and a society that has a common purpose.
Absolutely. Have you envisioned your book and the stories within it being made into a series or perhaps a film?
I haven't. I mean, some of the stories are very visual, very vivid, and very compelling, right? Hannah the Rainmaker, for example, is one of those stories that I think is very compelling that could easily be made into a movie. There is also another story that I thought could also form boys in times of war with kids running all over the place and hearing gunshots and all those things that are happening are very vivid. I try to capture in my description some of the experiences that I was feeling when those things were happening with me and my cousins and all the experiences that we had. I am open to any opportunities for anybody to explore those alternatives.
Absolutely. So Hollywood, if you're listening, this would be a great book. Take a look at these stories. They're fascinating.
Yes.
Chamberlain Diala has written a wonderful book. It is called Hannah the Rainmaker and Other Stories of My Ancestors. It's a collection of tales rooted in African tradition that offers a blend of family history and folklore, and it is just wonderful. You will enjoy each of these stories. Each is unique, each is compelling, each is highly entertaining. Chamberlain, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
Thank you, Logan. I appreciate your time.
Pleasure is all mine. I appreciate your time as well. And to the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.